Welcome to The Explainer, where we get right into the source material to break down some of history's biggest topics. Today, we are tackling a massive one, socialism and the Russian Revolution. We're going to see how a single powerful idea could completely upend a nation and really change the entire world. Let's just dive right in.
So, that's the big question for today, right? We're going to explore how the idea of socialism, which really came to life in 19th century Europe, became the match that lit the fuse on one of the most transformative and bloodiest events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution.
To really get what happened in Russia, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to go back to Europe in the decades after the French Revolution. It was this incredible whirlwind of new thinking, with all these ideas challenging the old way of doing things. You know, the world of kings and aristocrats.
So you had these different camps, right? There were the liberals, pushing for things like parliaments, but they mostly thought only men with property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals, who were like, hold on, that doesn't go far enough. They wanted a government based on what the majority wanted, and they even supported votes for women. And of course, you had the conservatives trying to pump the brakes, saying, whoa, any change has to be slow and steady. But while they were all arguing about the structure of government, another idea was bubbling up that challenged the very foundation of their society.
And that powerful game-changing idea was socialism. Socialists looked at what was happening with the Industrial Revolution, the brutal factory conditions, the massive gap between rich and poor, and they drew a really radical conclusion. The problem wasn't just about who gets to vote. The problem, they said, was private property itself. They saw it as the root of all social evil. And their solution? Society, everyone together, should control property for the good of all.
Now, as you can see here, not all socialists were on the same page about how to get there. You had thinkers like Robert Owen, who had this vision of building small, cooperative communities. Others, like Louis Blanc, thought government should step in and help those cooperatives along. But then you had Karl Marx, and for him, these ideas were just too timid. He believed capitalism wasn't something you could just tweak. It was a system of exploitation that had to be completely and violently overthrown by the workers themselves to create a whole new communist world.
Okay, so you have this revolutionary idea spreading across Europe, but why did it explode with such incredible force in Russia, of all places? Well, the answer is that the Russian Empire was basically a giant powder keg just waiting for a match.
You have to understand, Russia was completely different from Western Europe. Just look at these numbers. It was a vast, sprawling empire built on farming. A staggering 85% of its people were peasants. Now, this is a really crucial point. While socialists in places like Germany or Britain were talking to factory workers, any revolution in Russia had to speak to this huge, deeply unhappy rural population. And ruling over this massive empire was Tsar Nicholas II. Now, Russia wasn't a monarchy with a parliament or a constitution. It was an autocracy. That means the Tsar's power was absolute. It was completely unchecked. Whatever he said went. His will was law, period.
And this autocracy was sitting on top of a society that was in deep, deep distress. For the small but growing number of factory workers in the cities, conditions were just brutal. We're talking 12 to 15-hour workdays, horrible wages, and women getting paid half of what men earned. And out in the countryside, the peasants worked land they didn't own, had zero respect for the nobles, and more than anything, they just desperately wanted that land for themselves.
In 1905, that powder keg had its first big explosion. Wages collapsed and a huge wave of strikes hit the capital. When a peaceful group of workers marched to the Tsar's winter palace to ask for help, troops just opened fire, killing over 100 of them. This bloody Sunday was a turning point. It completely shattered the people's view of the Tsar as their great protector. He sort of reluctantly allowed a parliament, called the Duma, to be created, but then he made sure it had no real power. So all that anger just kept simmering.
And that simmering anger finally boiled over because of one single catastrophic event: the First World War. It was the final straw that sent the entire rotting structure of the Russian Empire crashing to the ground.
For Russia, the war was an absolute disaster. The army was getting hammered, with casualties climbing to over 7 million. Let that number sink in for a second. The war cut off industrial supplies, so factories started failing, and all the food was being sent to the army, which led to terrible shortages in the cities. People were literally rioting for bread. The entire nation was at its breaking point.
And in February 1917, it finally broke. And this revolution, it wasn't planned by anyone. It was like a spontaneous combustion. It started with strikes led by women over bread shortages. The government sent in the cavalry, but the soldiers refused to fire on the crowds and actually joined them. Within days, the Tsar's own generals were telling him it was over. He abdicated. And just like that, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was just gone.
Into this huge power vacuum stepped a temporary government. But into this chaos also returned the exiled leader of the radical Bolshevik Party, a man named Vladimir Lenin. And he arrived with this set of brutally simple demands. He called them the April Theses. And you can see his political genius right here. He promised to end the war, give land to the peasants, and take over the banks. He was basically offering a solution to every single person's biggest problem.
So while that provisional government was kind of flailing around, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were planning. See, unlike the spontaneous February Revolution, this second one was a meticulously organized coup. On October 24th, their forces started seizing key government buildings. By nightfall, they had stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the ministers. The Bolsheviks were now in power.
Now that they had seized power, the Bolsheviks did not waste a single second. They immediately started tearing down the old world and building a new, socialist one in its place. The changes were swift, they were total, and they were incredibly radical.
Their first moves were immediate and just huge. All industries and banks were taken over by the government. They declared all land to be social property, which was basically the green light for peasants to go and seize the estates from the nobles. Old titles like prince or duke were totally abolished. And crucially, Russia officially became a one-party state, with the renamed Communist Party holding all the power.
Well, as you can probably guess, this radical takeover plunged the country into a vicious 3-year-long civil war. On one side, you had the Bolshevik Reds, and on the other side, you had a messy coalition of whites that included everyone from pro-Tsarists, the liberals, to even other socialists. And they were backed by foreign countries like Britain, France, and the United States, who were all terrified of this new worker state and the idea of socialism spreading.
Ultimately, the Reds won the Civil War. But after Lenin died in 1924, the person who consolidated power would define the Soviet Union for the next 30 years, Joseph Stalin. He launched these incredibly ambitious 5-year plans. It was a program of forced, rapid industrialization designed to drag this peasant nation into the modern age, no matter what the cost.
And that cost was immense. While the state propaganda was full of heroic workers building this new socialist future, the reality for so many was just horrific. This slide shows a letter from a 13-year-old boy in 1933. He's being forced to give up his education to work in a factory just so his family won't starve to death. It's just a heartbreaking look behind the curtain of the official story.
And if it was bad in the cities, out in the countryside, Stalin unleashed an even more brutal policy: collectivization. The state forced millions of peasants to give up their land, their tools, their livestock, and join these huge state-run farms. The peasants resisted furiously, sometimes destroying their own cattle rather than hand them over. The state's response was arrest, execution, and exile. The result was chaos, a catastrophic drop in food, and a famine that killed over 4 million people.
So, after all of this turmoil, this violence, and this incredible transformation, what was the ultimate legacy of the Russian Revolution? Well, it's a story of profound and really difficult contradictions.
You absolutely cannot deny its global impact. The Russian Revolution fired up the imaginations of people all over the world. It inspired communist parties everywhere, from Great Britain to India, and it encouraged anti-colonial movements who saw a new way to get their freedom. And by the end of World War II, this nation, which had been so backward, had become a superpower, a true rival to the United States.
But, and this is the huge but, it achieved that status using methods that were the exact opposite of liberation. It denied its own citizens basic freedoms, it crushed anyone who disagreed, and it built its grand projects through repressive policies that cost millions and millions of lives. And that leaves us with the revolution's really tough, enduring question. It promised to build a paradise for the working class, but how can we possibly balance that promise against its staggering, unbelievable human price?